All right, let's start. So welcome to our webinar number 5. So today we will talk about integral field spectroscopy with the James Webb Space Telescope. So it's actually a quite popular mode on James Webb. It was very popular for the NIRISS program. So we'll dedicate this webinar to this mode. So as usual, I will start to give you a reminder of the IFU's capabilities with James Webb. And we will continue with a live demo of a real science case. And I will go through the exposure time calculator and the astronomer proposal tool. So let's start with some basics. So there are actually two IFUs on a James Webb, one on NIRSpec that will cover the near-infrared regime from 0.6 up to 5 micron. And beyond that, there is an IFU on MIRI, which is called the Medium Resolution Spectrometer, or MRS, that will cover the mid-infrared regime from 5 up to 30 micron. So it means that with James Webb, you can use two instruments to obtain an infrared integral field spectrum over the entire wavelength domain that is available to James Webb. So it's quite a very nice configuration to do some very nice science. So the two IFUs have actually quite similar field of view of about 3 by 3 arcseconds, and they have different configuration for a different resolution from a very low to very high resolution. So here is a plot of the resolution versus the wavelength. So as you can see, there are many options. So with NIRSpec, it's very similar to the fixed slit. Actually, with any mode on NIRSpec, it's possible to use any gratings and filter configuration. So with the IFU, it's possible to obtain in a single shot the entire near-infrared regime using the prism at a low resolution of about 100. But if you're interested in the medium and high resolution, about 1000 or 3000, you'll have to use 3 configurations, so 3 grisms through 3 filters to obtain the entire wavelength domain. For MIRI DMRS, the story is a bit different. So actually the resolution is decreasing with increasing wavelength from 3000 up to down to 1000 at the longest wavelength through many configurations. So basically, if you are interested in the highest resolution, you will have to design your observation using up to 7 configurations with the 2 instruments. And at low resolution, there is only NIRSpec that is available. So there is a reason behind this complexity for DMRS on MIRI. It's actually a very complex instrument. So DMRS is actually made of 4 IFUs, which are called channel. It goes from 1 to 4. They observe simultaneously. And each channel covers a dedicated wavelength range from 5 to 30 micron. So because all IFUs observe simultaneously, they must have the same duration on an exposure. They cannot observe for a different exposure time from one to another channels. So as you, yes, is there any question? I guess no. All right. So as you can see on the right image, the field of view of the different channels are different, but they are concentric. The smallest field of view is provided by the channel 1, so at the bluest wavelength, with a field of view of about 3.4 to 3.7 arcseconds, while the largest field of view is provided by the channel 4, so at the longest wavelength, and it's about twice the size of the channel 1. So because of this complex design, the jittering pattern and the mosaic might be different, whether you're interested in channel 1 and channel 4 and in all channels. So it means that for an observation, you will have to select the driver channel that will select basically the optimized jittering pattern and mosaic edges for your observation. But there are also some, please, can you mute yourself if you don't have any question? There are someone who is making some background noise. Thank you. So as I said, there is also a panel for the jitters that is optimized for all 4 channels if you're interested in the complete wavelength coverage. So moving on into the complexity. So actually the 4 IFUs are recorded onto 2 detectors, which are called the MRS short and MRS long, as you can see here in this snapshot. So channel 1 and 2 are recorded on a single detector, the short one, and channel 3 and 4 on the long detector. So it means that the channel 1 and 2 must have the same readout parameters, and the same is true for the channel 3 and 4. So same readout mode, same number of groups, same number of integrations. To add further complexity, the actually wavelength domain is broken into 3 subbands called short, medium, and long, or A, B, and C, as you can see here in this cartoon. So we have the 4 channels. Each channel is broken into 3 subbands. And since they are observed simultaneously, it means that you will get first exposure, the A channel, the A band on channel 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the B channel, the B band on the channel 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on. So the different bands can have different settings because they are done one after another, but it's not optimal and it's not recommended unless you have specific requirement, because it will induce longer overheads. So what you have to take out from this very complex design is the MRS is made of 4 IFUs with different but concentric field of view. So you have to choose a driver for the driver channel for the jittering and the mosaic. And all 4 IFUs must have the same exposure length, and the 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 must have the same readout parameters. That's all you have to keep in mind from this design. Also, there is no shutter on the imager on MIRI, and they cover a different field of view than the MRS, as you can see here on this cartoon. So it's possible, and actually it's the default configuration, to obtain a simultaneous image of your target during your MRS observation. So because the imager will act as a parallel observation, it has to follow the jittering pattern of the MRS observation, and it cannot integrate longer than the MRS exposure. But it can be very useful for astrometric purpose, so if you want to study kind of a nearby region of your target. Moving on to the IFU on NIRSpec. So here is a cartoon of the spectra at the highest resolution that are spread out on the 2 detectors. So y-axis is basically the spatial scale, and the spectral scale is on the horizontal axis. So as you can see, at the highest resolution, the spectra will be very extended, and actually they will be spread out over the 2 detectors. So there will be a gap in between. There is no way to recover this gap. So the size of the gap is about 0.1 micron. So keep in mind about this gap if you're interested in this specific region. You may have some issues. So the IFU spectra would be recorded at the same place at the MSA, while the slits have a dedicated space on the detector. There is no shutter on the slits, so it means that you will obtain a slitted spectrum of your target here. But you will also obtain some, you will also have some issues from the MSA. So as I said, the spectra of the IFU and the MSA are recorded on the same place. And because there are some fade open shutters on the MSA, if you have a very bright background or very extended target, light will go through those fade open shutters. They will create spectra that will contaminate your IFU spectra. So here is an actual data with a lamp during the ground-based test. So as you can see, there are a very tiny white spectrum that are due to those leakage through the MSA. So you will have to calibrate those leakage if you're interested in, especially at the low resolution, or if you have very bright background. So there's a way to calibrate this leakage, is to obtain an exposure of your target with the shutter closed on the IFU. So you will get this image the slits, obviously, because they are always open, but also the spectrum that are provided by the MSA only with the open shutters. So, and then with this configuration, this calibrated image will be subtracted from your science image, and then you will be clean from this emission. All right, moving on to nodding and jittering. So as usual on James Webb, jittering is highly recommended to improve the pixel sampling, and nodding also to obtain a background observation. This is especially true for MIRI because the background can be very high, especially at the longest wavelength. So nodding is recommended, and with at least one pointing away from your target and quite far away if you have an extended target. Jittering, the highly recommended as well. The MRS on MIRI and the IFU on NIRSpec are undersampled, so you have to jitter if you want to recover a good sampling. You can also use some very large steps with the jittering patterns if you have a very small or compact sources for background observations. So if we go into the details for MIRI, the MRS, so as I said, there are different patterns, whether they're optimized for channel 1, 2, 3, or 4, or for all channels. So here in the images, we have an example of the 4-point jitters. Each color corresponds to each channel, and the black one is for the extended option. So as you can see, the pattern is different. So they are very optimized for a specific channel. So there are 3 different configurations. There's a 2-point channel, it's like a nodding. So it will, the pattern has a very large offsets, larger than 1 arcsecond, and it will provide a half integer sampling for all channels, but it's not optimal because there are some distortion in the field of view. That's why the default jittering pattern and the one that is recommended for point source or compact source is the 4-point, so the one that is shown here on the right. So it provides a optimal sampling, taking into account some very fine effects, just like distortion or detector effect. And it provides the optimal sampling for all 4 channels. And lastly, there is a pattern designed for very extended target that will make very small offsets to improve the sampling. For NIRSpec, the story is very similar. There is a 2-point node jitter using 2 points 1.6 arcsecond away that is optimal for point source that would be used for background subtraction. There is the equivalent with 4 points, so very extended steps, very large steps for very small source if you want to estimate the background. There is also a 4-point jitter that will use very small step with 0.4 arcsecond on side to improve the sampling. And there is also the cycle pattern, so it's up to the user to choose the number of points from 1 up to 60, and the size. There are 3 sizes, small, medium, and large, depending on the morphology of your source. So that's it for the jittering. Target acquisition. So for the IFU, especially on extended target, you will be allowed to do a simple point and shoot. So because you are not really how to say a very precise pointing on extended source is not maybe mandatory for your science case. So you will be allowed to do a point and shoot, but it's actually not the case today on the current version of the APT, but it will be made on the next release this month, but it will be allowed. On the other hand, if you have a small or a compact source, you might want to do some target acquisition to improve the position. So yes, just as I said, if you do the point and shoot, you will be submitted to the absolute precision of the FGS, which is less than 0.5 arcsecond. So, but if you do want to do a target acquisition with MIRI MRS, it will be done on the imager, so very close to the MRS, as we can see here on this cartoon. So it can be done with one of 3 filters or a neutral density. The target acquisition can be done on the target or on a nearby point source, but the source has to be very nearby, so within 50 arcseconds to achieve the required accuracy. NIRSpec, there are different options. So there is the target acquisition called known. So actually no target acquisition is done at all. There is also the verify only option. So actually this option is very interesting for IFU observation of extended targets. So with this option, no correction will be done on the pointing, but instead, after your science exposure, a visit what it's called a post-visit image will be taken with no gradings, but the mirror, either through the MSA or through the IFU. So this image won't be used by the backline, but you can use it to have a better estimate of the astrometry of your source within the field of view of NIRSpec. The standard target acquisition mode is called the MSTA, so it's done via the MSA. The standard mode if you have small object, and it will be done on reference stars. Instead, if you have a very bright and very compact source, you might want to choose the wide aperture target acquisition mode that will use the wide aperture slit to perform the target acquisition on your science target. Lastly, readout. So here a reminder of the James Webb jargon. So an observation is made of several exposure. An exposure is made of several ramps, which are called integration. Each readout is called a frame, and it's possible to average several frames together in what's called a group. It's also possible to skip some frames. So there have been several designs of the readout mode to limit the data volume during an observation. So all you have to set up for your observation will be the number of groups, the readout mode, and the number of integration. So for IFU observation on MIRI, there are two modes. The slow one, which is the default, but there is also the fast one. So they both have the same number of frames and number of skips, but they differ in the way the pixel is read out. So the fast mode might be better for you if you have a very bright target. For NIRSpec, there are as well two options. So the NRS, which is the default one. So 4 frames would be read out and averaged into a group. But if you have a bright target, you might want to choose the NRS rapid mode, in which each frame will be kept during your observations. So actually both readout mode can be combined with the called IRS squared, improved resolution, sensitivity, and sampling mode. So basically this mode is recommended if you have a very faint, fuzzy target on a very low background, and it will provide a better sensitivity for your observations. All right, I guess that's it for the recap. Is there any questions so far before moving on to the live demo?
Victor Halak, I have one question about, so if I would like to observe stars, I can use the same IRS square mode as well if star is like quite not well bright.
If your star is quite faint, that is the option that you want to go with, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, so we'll go through each step as usual. So just to remind you that the proposals are due April 6th this year. You will have to submit your phase 1 as well at the same time. So here we'll go through the ETC, the exposure time calculator, and the astronomer proposal tool. So the science case I chose was to study the AGN of NGC 4151. So it's a well-known nearby galaxy, very bright, very extended, with an active central NGN. So we are interested into the gas kinematics around the central region. So to do that, we will obtain an IFU spectroscopy with the true instrument at the highest resolution. And we want the full wavelength coverage. We request for our science case a signal to noise ratio per pixel of about 100 on the central engine. So as we see here on the right image, the target is quite extended, but we are interested in the very center of the galaxy, so the central 200 parsec, which basically corresponds to a size of 3 arcseconds which is the size of the IFU. So I will go through the different steps. So we'll start with the SSCAI. So it's kind of a visualizer. So we'll go to the target NGC 4151. It's here, very bright, very extended target. This is what we want to image. So I will add the NIRSpec IFU, NIRSpec, the IFU. So it's here, this very little square here. This is the IFU on the central target. So just to remind you, we are interested in this central 200 parsec, which corresponds to actually the size of the field of view of the NIRSpec IFU. We'll also do MIRI observation with the MRS. So I will add it, MRS. Here we see the square. So actually the square corresponds to the channel 4, so the largest field of view. The channel 1 has a field of view very similar to NIRSpec IFU. Do we need a specific orient for James Webb for our observation? The answer is no, because the source is centrosymmetric, so we can observe it at any time during the year, which is great for the schedulability. Also, the imager will be open, and we will record the data on MIRI simultaneously with the MRS. So as you can see here, we will image the nearby galaxy, the galaxy in the spirals actually, which is nice. With MIRI, we will need a background observation. So we have to find a region which is close enough to minimize the slew time of the telescope, but far enough to be away of the fuzzy extended emission of the galaxy. So we can be like here, or here, or here. It's better if there is no source in this region. So let's say this region is quite nice. So we have the coordinate on the top left side of the window. So I will write down the coordinate to be used in the APT at the end of the demo. Do we want a target acquisition? The source is quite extended. We don't really require a very precise pointing. The FGS is fine enough. But if we want, for the MRS, I said that the target, for the target acquisition, has to be within 50 arcseconds. So if I zoom on a field of view similar to that size, here it is. So we are completely within the galaxy. So there is no way we can do the target acquisition on a nearby point source. There is no one. So we won't do any target acquisition for our observation. All right. So we can now move on to the exposure time calculator. Here it is, James Webb EDC. I will log in with my account. Click on proceed. And I will create a new workbook for this specific program. So because I want to spend a bit more time today on the APT than on the ETC, because there are some specific cases that I want to show you today on the APT, I will go through the very basic stuff on the ETC, and it will be actually okay. So let's start to create our sources. So I will update the default source with what I want. So actually, I have a spectrum of the source that was obtained with Spitzer that covers 5 to 30 microns. So that will be useful to simulate our observation with MIRI. So I will start by creating the source with that spectrum. So it's actually the spectrum on of the nucleus of the target. So I will update the spectral energy distribution with the spectrum. So for that, I have to upload the spectrum. So I click on upload and I will load my file. So it's here. It's an ASCII file, 2 columns, wavelength, flux. Successful. So if I go back to the source, I do see now here my spectrum. I can use it for my ECD. renormalization, of course, it's the actual spectrum of my source, so I do not need to normalize. Shape, it's an extended source. I will make my source as a Gaussian. So as I said, 200 parsecs correspond to roughly 3 arcseconds. So the size of my source will have a semi-major axis of about 1.5 arcseconds. Same for the semi-minor axis. All right. I click on Save. If I go here, we do see the very nice spectrum that was obtained with Spitzer. So we do see here that the spectrum do not go below 5 microns, but we want to do NIRSpec observation in the near-infrared. So we have to create a new source with a near-infrared ACD. So I create a new source, so NGC 4151 in the near-infrared. We don't have any spectrum, unfortunately, for that source in the near-infrared, so I will use a proxy for that. In the preloaded library, I will use another AGN Cepheid Galaxy that is NGC 4138. All right. Obviously, I need to renormalize that spectrum to the actual brightness of my source, which is 60 milligenskin at 1 micron, and I will give it the same shape, so extended, same size, and it was renormalized as an integrated flux. I click on Save. All right. So now I have to create my scene using those sources. So there is a bug on the ETC from time to time. It's not always there, but basically, if you want to create a multi-component source in a single scene, it's possible. So I would have been able to associate that scene with the 2 sources at the same place, so that I will have a single source with the complete wavelength coverage of my ACD. But from time to time, the ETC does not recognize that there are 2 spectrum on that source. So basically, I recommend to create a scene for a given source. So the scene 1 will be with the source number 1, as it here. So that will be for MIRI in the mid-infrared. And I click on Save. And I will create a new scene here. I will add the near-infrared source, and I will call it NGC 4151 near-infrared. All right. So I have 2 scenes, 1 for each wavelength domain. So now we can do the calculation. So let's start with NIRSpec, the IFU. IFU here, scene, I will select the near-infrared source. Background, it will be the low configuration. My target is so bright that won't be a limiting factor. It's okay. Instrument setup. As we saw during the presentation, at the highest resolution, we need 3 configurations through 3 gratings and 3 filters. So here, the one that are labeled with an H. So you don't have to do the calculation for each single gratings. Just think about your source and your science. What you want to do is to find the highest number of groups before saturating the detector and the actual number of integration to reach the required signal-to-noise ratio. So what you can do is actually to create a first calculation in the filter bandpass that is associated with the brightest part of the ACD of your source, so that you can find the maximum number of groups at which you will saturate the observation. And then you can move on to the completely opposite, so the faintest part of the ACD of your source, and update the number of integration to achieve the required signal-to-noise ratio. If you do that, at the other configuration, the signal-to-noise ratio will be automatically higher because your source will be higher. All right? I hope I am clear. So if I go back to my source in the near-infrared, we do see here, so from 1 to 5 micron, this is the wavelength domain for NIRSpec. So we see that the source is the brightest around 1.5 micron and the fainter at the end of the band. So we will check out whether our source saturates at the brightest, in the brightest regime. So it's in this grading, so G140H with the filter 100. So we see here the bandpass, so it corresponds to the brightest part of the SED. We'll update this strategy. So there are two strategies, node in scene and node off scene. So because the target is so extended, it fills in the entire field of view of NIRSpec, so we have to use the IFU node off scene. So by doing that, the background will be calculated from a pre-computed table corresponding to the level we have chosen here in this tab. I will center my aperture on the source, and I have to define an aperture radius. So I want to measure an SNR per pixel. So the pixel size of NIRSpec is 0.1 arcsecond, but it's a square, and my aperture is a circle. So I have to compensate the size of the circle by the size of the square, so multiplied by square root of 4 over pi. So that is 0.12 arcsecond. So I need an aperture of 0.12 arcsecond to mimic a squared pixel. Wavelength of interest, let's put it at the center of the band. So this is useful for the, so it will be the wavelength of interest for the number that will be printed out here on this line. I can click on calculate. So actually the calculation will be quite long because the spectrum is very dense. There are many lines, which is not optimal actually because it takes quite some time. But see, oh no, oops, there is something that I had to update is the detector setup. Sorry. So basically here we see we have to define the subarray. So for the IFU, there is only the full frame option, the readout pattern, the NRS, this is the default mode, and it's okay. Groups, integration, and exposure. So here we want to find what is the maximum number of groups before saturation, but actually the NIRSpec team recommend to limit the single integration within 1500 seconds to limit the contamination by cosmic rays. So here we see the default number of group is 10, which correspond to 400 seconds roughly. So if I put this through 30, we are kind of close to the limit of the maximum length recommended by the team. So let's see if we do saturate with 30 groups in a single integration. Again, take some time because there are many lines. In the meantime, if you have any question, I know that I'm going quite fast, but it's kind of straightforward. It will be done soon, hopefully. All right, it's here. So we do see that with 30 integration, we do not saturate. We do not saturate, so which is great. We are in a regime where the target is very bright and we do not saturate within the recommended exposure length. So we can now change the instrument setup and do the calculation in the region where the source is the faintest, so which is the last configuration, so grading and filters. We have to update the strategy. So basically the wavelength of interest has to be within the filter band pass. So let's put 4 micron here, detector. So we can now update the detector setup. So we won't change the number of groups because it's fine, we do not saturate and we always want to maximize the number of groups. But actually we want to update the number of exposures. So in the ETC, the number of exposure is very similar to the number of jitter points. Extended source, the recommended option is the 4-point jittering configuration. So we will obtain 4 exposures times 30 groups per integration. So let's see if a single integration provides the SNR that we want, that is 100 roughly at the center of the band. So it takes some time again. So basically, we don't need to repeat the exercise for the intermediate gradings because, as I said, we do not saturate, the source will be brighter, so we will obtain a higher SNR for our observation. We want to keep the same exposure setups for our observation, so we don't need to do the calculation for the 3 configuration. And the same will be true for MIRI. As we saw, there are many configurations, 4 channels, 3 subbands. So we will do exactly the same kind of exercise with MIRI in a moment, as soon as the calculation is done. All right, so we do see the plot here. So there is a gap here that corresponds to the dead region in between the 2 detectors. And as we see, we have roughly a signal-to-noise ratio of 100 on our source, so which is great. So we'll keep this configuration for the APT, so 30 groups, a single integration, and 4 exposures, and corresponding to the 4 jitter pattern. So let's do now the MRS calculation for MIRI. So here we'll take the scene. Oh, it's loading the spectrum in the near-infrared by default. All right, MIRI. So we'll need the scene in the mid-infrared. The sound is okay, background, same low. Instrument setup. So as I said, 4 channels, 3 subbands. So you don't need to do the calculation for each configuration. Several reasons. Channel 1 and 2 are recorded on the same detectors, so they will have the same readout mode, as I said during the presentation, in the same number of groups. So you can do either 1 or the 2. The same is true for channel 3 and 4. Hey, it's loading, okay. And then for the subbands, unless you have some specific requirements, you can have the same configuration for the 3 bands. So basically, we do exactly the same as for MIRI. As for NIRSpec, we will do the calculation in the region where the target is the brightest to check the saturation level, and then we'll do the actual calculation in the channel where the target is the faintest to achieve the required SNR. So if I go back to the source and I will go back to the spectrum, so here, okay, again here, why don't I want to show you the source spectrum? What's not loading? That's a good question. Okay. Oh, it has to be checked. Sorry. Nope. Actually, I don't know why. So, but if you recall the spectrum, it was like this. It was the brightest at the end of the, oh, I know why. Because the domain, here it is. Sorry. So the source is the brightest, around 20 up to 30 micron, and the faintest around 5 micron. So we'll do the calculation to check out the saturation level in the channel 4 and in the subband C, so corresponding to the 24 up to 28 micron region. Strategy, just like NIRSpec, node off-scene, because the target is filling the entire field of view. We want to center the aperture on the source. The plate scale of the channel 4 is 29.29 arcseconds, so we have to adjust for the area of a square. So there is 0.33. All right. Wavelength of interest at the center of the band, which is around 36.35 micron. Detector setup, full array, the only option possible. The target is very bright, so we'll go with the fast option. Maximum number of groups before saturation. The MIRI team recommend that the maximum length of an integration has 360 groups at most. So let's go with that. And we'll see whether we will saturate or not. As we do see here, we do not saturate, which is very great. So we can move on to the channel in which the target is the faintest. So channel 1, subband A. We have to update the strategy. So the wavelength of interest is around 5.4 micron. The plate scale is different for the channel 1, is about 19.19 arcseconds. So the size of the aperture would be 0.21 here. Detector setup. So same number of groups because we do not saturate. Exposure, so again, as recommended for an extended source, we'll use the 4-point pattern. So I will update the number of exposure with the 4 here and click on calculate. We want a signal-to-noise ratio of about 100 per pixel at the center of the band. So let's see if we achieve this sensitivity. So there's a warning. If we go to the warning, it tells you basically that the spectrum that was provided on the source does not cover the wavelength range corresponding to the feature bandpass. So as we saw, the spectrum stops at 5.2 micron. So basically, do not believe what's below 5.2 micron. But what we do see here that in the region with a real spectrum, we reach roughly a signal-to-noise ratio of about 250. That is much larger than what we need by actually a factor of 2.5. So we have to reduce the number of groups by the square of that. And it's actually around 60. Because I did my job before this webinar and did my homework. So let's see with 60. So 60 groups, we reach a signal-to-noise ratio of about 100. One integration, 4 dealer points, which is fine. So again, we don't have to repeat the exercise. We'll use the same setup for the 3 subbands and all 4 channels because we will always anyway get a higher SNR at the longer wavelength. So that's it for the ETC. Actually, as we say, as I said, we will obtain a simultaneous image with MIRI. So you will have to go through the ETC with the imaging mode and doing the same exercise. So we did it in the webinar number 3. So I will not repeat the exercise here, but it's very straightforward. And with the ETC, if you want to do a target acquisition, which is not the case for us here, but there is also a template on the ETC that you want to go through to optimize the settings of the target acquisition. But basically, that's it for the ETC for our science case. So we'll move on to the APT. Is there any question on the ETC part? I guess it's a no. So moving on to the astronomer proposal 2. So I created a new James Webb proposal, and I will create my target. So using the fixed target resolver. So NGC 4151, it's here. I can open up those tabs and go to my target. That is my target. It's a galaxy. It's an active galactic nuclei. It's a Cepheid galaxy. All right. The coordinate, it's extended. Background target. We do require a background observation for our MIRI observation. So I will check that box. And so we have to create a new target with the background for the background observation. So I will duplicate that target. I will update the name as the NGC 4151 background. So I have to update the coordinate with the one we found on the sky. That was the following. And then declination 25, 36.6. So it's no longer extended. And we don't need a background observation to this background target, obviously. So I will uncheck this mark. So I will go back to my target. I can now select the background target to be associated to this target as a background observation. And now there's a trick. So with NIRSpec, we don't need a background observation. If we were to use the same target, and if we were to not design an observation of a background with NIRSpec, there will be an error. Because of this link here, the APT requires a background observation, very similar to, identical to your science observation. So you have to create, so this target will be specific to MIRI because there is a link to the background observation. And we will duplicate this target just for NIRSpec, and I will uncheck this check mark so that I can use this specific target for my NIRSpec observation without any background observation. So I can now create my observation. So we'll start with MIRI, the MRS. All right, it's here, observation number 1. So label, make it very explicit. It will help you, but also it will help the reviewer of your program. There'll be MIRI, MRS on the science target. I load the template of the MRS. The target is MIRI science. So target acquisition, we don't want to do a target acquisition on this target as we saw before because it's very bright and extended. And in this current version of the APT, it's not possible to skip this, this step, but it will be possible in the next release. So I will not show you the details here. And we'll move on to the parameters of our observation. So first we have to design which channel will be the driver for our observation. We are interested in the complete wavelength coverage, so we want our observation to be optimized for all 4 channels. If we were interested only in, say, the bluest part of the spectrum or the reddest part of the spectrum, we could choose one of the 4 channels. But here we want an optimization for the 4 channels. So we can add the jittering pattern. So by default is the 4 points for extended source. As we specified, our source was extended. So this is exactly what we want. Then sense exposure. So we want a simultaneous imaging. Yes, images subarray. So with the ATC, if we were to do the calculation, we saw that we would have seen that we needed the bright sky subarray to prevent saturation. All right, and then we have to select the wavelength range. So actually, do we want to observe in a single subband or all subband? Using the same configuration. So when you select all here, the settings that we will put in here will be the same for the 3 subbands, A, B, and C. So let's do that. I will click on Add. So I have the settings for the imager, the NIRSS long detectors, and the NIRSS short detector. Filters for the imager, we are interested in the 1130 wide filters. Training groups, because this is what we saw with the ETC, and the jittering pattern number 1. NIRSS long, we saw that we needed 60 group. So the 2 detectors have the same exposure length, which is what is mandatory. They could have had different number of group and integration, but the multiplication of the 2 numbers here must have to be equivalent. And they all follow the jitter 1 pattern. So with this design, basically the exposure will be done as follows. So it will go through the imager, to the A subband on the 4 channels, and it will obtain the image with the imager at the same time. And then it will move on to the exposure on the subband B, and it will repeat the exposure on the imager with the same filters, and again for the subband C. So basically with this configuration, it is not possible to change the filters for the 3 exposures. If you want to do so, because, I don't know, you're interested in a photometric measurement in different filters in the colors of the nearby source, you will have to duplicate this observation for each band. So basically here you will select the short A. So those settings will be specific for the short A observation, and only the short A observation will be executed here. And then you will have to duplicate this block here and adapt your settings with the medium B, and here you will change your filters, and the same for the subband C. But if you do so, you will basically increase the overheads of the observation. So unless you have a specific science case, it is recommended to do a single configuration for all 3 bands. All right, so now we have to create the background observations for MIRI. So we will duplicate, let's go here. We will duplicate this observation here for the background. This will be for the background. So the target will be the background target. We don't need to jitter the background because we know there are no sources here. We want the same imager, same configuration, and we don't need to jitter. So I will set it to none. All right. And we also want the background observation to be observed back to back with the science target. So we have to specify a special requirement, which is on the timing. So we grouped these 2 observations together in a non-interruptible sequence. When we do so, the observation of the science and the background will be executed back to back. So this is what we want. Okay, that's done for MIRI. Now we can create the NIRSpec observation of with the IFU. So I will load the template of the IFU. The target specific for NIRSpec because we don't need any background observation here. Target acquisition. The source is very extended, so we don't want to perform a target acquisition, but we want to know where was our pointing location. So we'll do the verify only. So we'll take an image without any grading, but the mirror. We have several options here. We'll do it in the F110 wide feature. The post-visit exposure time, so in the NIRSS rapid mode because the target is very bright, and actually 5 group is enough for our purpose. MSA configuration, we don't want the MSA to be open because the galaxy is super bright. So the verifying only will be obtained with the shutter open on the IFU, but all the shutters of the MSA closed. All right. So these pointing verification image will be taken after the science sequence. So now we can, just like MIRI, update the parameter for the science. So we want a 4-point jitter, not a node, because we have an extended source, so the 4-point jitter. We can also choose the cycling option with the small size. And for steps, it's very similar to the 4-jitter point option. And then we now have to add the grading and filter combination. So let's do it for the first grading. So G140H NRS, that is the readout mode we want. We saw that we needed 30 groups in a single integration. Jittering is by default here. Auto calibration. So it is recommended not to take any auto calibration. It will be done in the calibration program. And you see here that there is a checkbox for the leak cal. So this is what I described during the presentation. So do you want to calibrate the leakage of the background through the MSA? So in our case, it's yes, because the target is very bright. So a lot of light will go through the open shutter and will contaminate our spectra. So we have to duplicate this block with the shutter on the IFU, so that only light through the MSA will go through on the detector, and we don't need to jitter the this leak cal option because our target is very bright. We only want to subtract the background. It's okay. And actually, now we will repeat the exercise for the other gradings. So G235. This is not a leak cal, but we want a leak cal for this grading as well, without any jitter. And I will duplicate for the last grading, so G395H, and I will create the last leak cal observation without any jitters. All right, oops, sorry. So this is done for NIRSpec. So what, oh, shoot. So let's have a look at the data volume. So all our observation will provide 7 gigabytes of data, which is below the limit of 58, which is okay. For MIRI, it's the same, 4 gigabytes, the background, 1 gigabyte. We are within the limit, so it's okay. So now we can evaluate the schedulability of our observation. So I clicked on the visit planner and update the display here. It will calculate the schedulability of our observation. From MIRI, we see here the windows. And if we go back to the form editor, we do see here the total science time of our program is about 11 hours. And using taking into account the overheads, the total time will be 16 hours. So the efficiency of that program is quite good. And it's within 25 hours, so it's a small size program. All right, so now you're free to update the titles, the abstract, the different keywords, to update the description and the PI. So I think we are done. What things that I would like to mention is the possibility to do a mosaic with the IFU. By going to the mosaic property tab here, you can do a mosaic of your observation, of your target with MIRI, also with NIRSpec. It's an option available. All right, I am done for everything that I wanted to show. Is there any question so far? So again, this webinar was recorded, so we'll put the APT file, the spectrum of the target and the slides on our website, so we'll be able to go back to this lot of information in the near future if you want some refresh. All right, so it's been an hour since I'm talking, so we can stop here, unless there are someone who wants some specific to deal with specific cases. I can stay here for a moment, but if not, you're free to go, and we will resume in 2 weeks with the MSA on NIRSpec. Thank you.